get started.
Okay.
I think. Okay. So I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which this public lecture is hosted. The Murrawina of what is now known as Southeast Tasmania, an island off the southeast tip of Australia. This land, Lutruwita, was never ceded, and we pay our respects to those past and present who remain the traditional and rightful owners. My name is Kate Booth, and I'm an Associate Professor of Human Geography in the School of Geography, Planning and Spatial Sciences at the University of Tasmania. I would like to welcome our diverse audience today, zooming in from across industry sectors, government agencies, university disciplines, environment and climate NGOs and activists, and across countries. So welcome to you all. Today we're convening on Murrawina land to speak about renewable technologies in the context of aspirations for a green transition. This conversation is really important for universities like the University of Tasmania as we foreground sustainability and justice across our research, teaching and operations. We must get this right if we as a university and as academics are to contribute in a meaningful way. I want to make it clear that today we're not interested in the climate denying criticisms of renewables that proliferate in the United States, in some parts of Australian politics and on social media. This is to put it bluntly, a load of made up conspiratorial junk. And in promoting this event, we've been trolled by such people, one of whom referred to us as, wait for it, this is a real zinger, referred to us as stupid koalas. Ouch. So what we are interested in today is robust and careful research that addresses the reality of our energy predicament. So we proceed from the basis of reality, imaginings. So the Murrawina experienced the full force of colonial invasion 200 years ago, and Aboriginal Tasmanians continue to fight for rights to their land, the protection of significant cultural sites and appropriate acknowledgement and respect as traditional owners. In other parts of the world, there are people and communities also countering the legacy of colonialisation and ongoing imperialist appropriation of land and culture. This includes the construction of wind and solar facilities in places deemed empty and unimportant, the mining of rare minerals where children can be the source of labour, and growing conflict and war over resources, potentially over the minerals needed for a green transition. As our speaker today, Associate Professor Simon Michaux, describes, minerals are emerging as the new oil. This is not simply in response to climate change. It is also in response to evidence suggesting we have passed what is known as peak oil, that fossil fuels are becoming harder and more expensive to find and extract. Thus, the minerals needed for alternative energy sources are rapidly becoming the new oil and reflect similar patterns of colonialistic and imperialistic social and ecological violence as we have witnessed for decades over oil. To begin, Simon is an Associate Professor of Geometallurgy at the Geological Survey of Finland, this being the statistical analysis of metal and geological data in mine resource modelling to provide a holistic picture of a resource. He is a technical problem solver across multiple sections of the mining industry and the industrial recycling industry, and he is working on development and transformation towards a circular economy. So thank you for joining us from Finland today, Simon, and I will hand over to you.
Hello, thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. So shall I start sharing? Okay. So sharing, let me know when you can see the presentation mode. Is that good?
I think we're on, hang on a sec, I just need to, I think you need to click display settings at the top and it'll flick into the full page mode. Does that make sense? It worked before.
I'll stop share. So what we'll do is, hang on, share again.
It just
Okay,
had the screen with the speaker's notes on it.
So
that's perfect.
Okay. Is that the full screen or is it only part of it?
Full screen.
Okay, lovely. All right, rock and roll. So I'm going to show you a quick summary across what's been done for the last few years. This is a lightning fast summary of multiple pieces of work. What I've done is assembled the material requirements of what would it look like if we were to actually phase out fossil fuels and replace all existing systems with non-fossil fuel system alternatives. What would that look like? Why was this done? When I first came to Europe in 2015, I used to attend European Commission meetings on behalf of the university I was working for, to actually sort of create and generate funding proposals and establish relationships and consortiums. There was no credible feasibility plan for the fundamental macro scale transition away from fossil fuels. There was a lot of talk, but I was expecting to see as something as important as this, we will now make X number of power stations of a certain type. We will put them in this region. They'll be operated by this. There was no discussion at that level of things. And there was a clear lack of hard numbers on all fronts. The entire thing that I was seeing was arm waving. And this worried me. Coming out of Australia at the time when there was the mining crash, I had actually, everything had come apart. People who were doing damn good work were losing their jobs. And I come to Europe and there was such a lot of money being thrown around on something so insubstantial. I was worried that when things turned tough, most of the people around me would not be able to maintain their professional positions. So there was very little discussion about current industrial dependency on fossil fuels. Like, what do fossil fuels actually do for us? We've got to understand that if we're to replace them. There was no visibility at all about society's dependency on minerals. And yet, coming from the mining industry in Australia, I knew damn well that we were indeed dependent on minerals. What struck me in Europe was the whole commodities sector was considered a market phenomenon. The price goes up, we'll throw money at it, new supplies will appear as if by magic. They did not understand that the commodities industry was a finite series of non-renewable natural resources that had engineering bottlenecks in extraction. There's just no visibility of that. And so assumptions and promises were being made on multiple industrial sectors that I knew would not be able to deliver. It wasn't just mining and mineral processing, but it was also smelting and recycling. And I pointed out to my management at the time, this is the Geological Survey, that at some point in the near future, the European captains of industry would turn to the European Geological Surveys, GTK in particular, because we're managing a battery minerals portfolio, and ask this question: why didn't you tell us? Some very, very basic preliminary calculations were showing the gigafactories they were planning to build in Europe, most of them will not be built because we would not be able to justify the source of minerals. Before we get there, let's look at a few other things about why we're having this discussion now. So this is total liquids production. This is gasoline. In November 2008, we had a localized peak. And then we had COVID, the gift that keeps on giving, and the industry crash, that's that dip here. And now we're recovering. And you can see by the rate of recovering that, we might be able to surpass that peak. Let's unpack that. The blue is crude oil. And there's our localized peak there, and things are declining, and it does look like that, you know, crude oil is not going to come back. So that is indeed what we call peak oil. However, a big chunk of what we call gasoline is now made from biofuels, and 48% of all gasoline coming out of the United States is now made from natural gas. We are supplanting the oil industry with the gas industry now. So what we call peak oil now has to be re-examined, as in reinvented. We are building an inefficiency into the oil and gas market that is going to cost us dearly later. This is not terribly bright in terms of efficiency. It's a bullet. It's a band-aid on a bullet wound. What this shows, though, is one way or another, we need to be discussing the transitioning out of fossil fuels. It's going. They're going. It should go. But it's going now. And so we've really got to look at, like, what is our capability to do this now? So strategic decision-making, if adopted by most nations, have been around carbon emissions to go for climate change targets. Okay, great, good. But there's been no discussion at all about the dwindling finite resources, either the ones we are using now or the ones we might use to mitigate climate change. So I developed a system where I suppose you'd call it bottom-up. I started from the end and worked my way backwards. What would it take to replace the entire system around you now? All the cars, all the trucks are now EVs and hydrogen fuel cells. All electricity is now a non-fossil fuel system of some kind. What would that look like? I did this for the world, for Europe, the United States, and China. Key findings? Well, here's the map. The three primary fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, in the year 2018, across that calendar year, these were the basic tasks. Most studies have focused only on and exclusively on the transport grid, and within the transport grid, until a few years ago at least, they looked at passenger cars only. They didn't look at trucks. They are starting to look at trucks now. They didn't look at trains. I have yet to hear anyone talk about maritime shipping in a numbers engineering context. And aviation is also something that they've yet to actually get to. So I've put together a series of scenarios where all short-range vehicles are electric vehicles. You might notice that we need 65.19 terawatt hours of batteries. Now, all studies I came across came to the conclusion that they needed only gigawatt hour scale batteries. I've got terawatt hours. Now, what's happening there is I think the size of the transport fleet has been misdiagnosed. All heavy vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells. Aircraft, possible biofuel. Petrochemical plastics go to bioplastics. Petrochemical fertilizers had no viable replacement at the time, and I believe that's still the case. Electrical power generation, heating of buildings was mainly gas. Steel manufacture was a bit of coal. And all of that was then folded into that number there. So if we were to charge the batteries, that's the amount of power that we would need. And if we were to make the hydrogen, that's the amount of power we'd need to make the hydrogen. So put all that together, and we need 37,289.7 terawatt hours of power annually on top of all existing non-fossil fuel systems. We're not going to use we're not allowed to use fossil fuels anymore, like no more gas and coal. Here are options. The elephant in the room, the blind spot, sorry, is power storage to manage intermittent supply fluctuations. Now, I came on 28 days. This was a really conservative estimate based on what I was looking at. In the literature, they've got estimates of, say, 5 or 6 hours. Those estimates, I believe, are badly wrong. And if we have time, we can discuss about why I believe that. But if we can't have an intermittent, like a power storage to smooth out wind and solar, then wind and solar in their current form are not viable. And that is something we need to address. All right, here are the numbers graphically. Oh, to be clear, we will do the green transition and we will use these technologies. It's not a question whether we should or should not do it. We will do it. What my work is showing is it won't work as well as we hope, and we might, for example, go back to the drawing board and reinvent a few systems. Here are the numbers graphically. On the left, 2018. The coloured sections are the bits we want to keep, the non-fossil fuel generation. Oil, gas and coal are the parts that we want to phase out. And on the right, so we had 26,614 terawatt hours of energy consumption in 2018. This is electric power generation. Here's the numbers graphically. Charge the batteries, produce the hydrogen, generate electrical power, heat the buildings, and coal-fired steel manufacture across the top. So what's being proposed here is we wish to construct an electrical system which is much larger than the existing power grid, using energy that is more expensive and not as effective as what we have now. Now, these numbers, as large as they are, don't include everything. It doesn't include coal and gas used directly by industry to generate heat and manufacture. For example, to make a solar panel, you've got to carve it up into heat the silicon to 2,200 degrees Celsius, and at the moment they use coking coal to do it. Take away the coking coal, what are our options? Well, you can use biofuels, you can use hydrogen, or you can do an electric arc. All of those systems work fine in a small scale, but when you want to scale them up to quantity to match what's being done now, that's when the trouble starts. So the outcome is this: current plans are not large enough in scope, and the task before us is much larger than the current paradigm really allows for. Fossil fuels, well, phasing them out is a larger task than first thought too. And in fact, the conclusion is we should have really started this 20, 30 years ago. And then we might have a more sensible conversation about this. So if this is the amount of power that we need, if we were to take an energy split prediction from the IEA of what they think the energy split will be at 2050, and if we were to apply that and project that onto what's needed here, and then project that onto the actual performance of each of these systems of average size in 2018, we would need 607,000 new non-fossil fuel stations. Now, to put this in context, the existing fleet is about 46,423 stations. Now, what's happening there is to phase out a single fossil fuel, so let's say a coal-fired power station. How many solar panels do you need to replace a single coal-fired power station? And that's the answer. It's quite a lot. So you have to also remember a coal-fired power station is available 92% of the time, or about that. Whereas electrical power delivered by solar in the year 2018, it was producing power 11.4% of the time. So you'll have many, many, many of these assets on the ground, but they're idle most of the time because they're susceptible to the weather. The power storage buffer calculations is to look just at that. It's assume the rest of the system can balance itself. I still think that's a conservative estimate of what's been put together. And if we have time, we'll go into why I think that. So new power systems need a buffer support. Why is that? So here's Net Zero America. In the literature, they often quote, we only need 5 hours buffer storage. And it comes down to studies like this. This was put out by Princeton University and in the United States. And they did a fairly sophisticated study in terms of what renewable power could look like. And so they had a series of simulations that look something like this. The solid line is the load. This is the load the demand load. On a day-to-day cycle, it goes up and down. Sometimes we're generating more power than we need. This is the yellow bit at the top. What they would do is they would collect this and they would keep it for a few days and they would release it when the power demand, demand exceeds supply. In this model, they're only looking at a couple of days, the intermittent day-to-day differences in storage. They're not looking at the long-term stuff. This is European electricity in 2021. All countries, no one makes just enough power. They either make too much or too little, and then they trade amongst themselves, and that's how they're balancing out. So all networks are balanced and buffered by external networks. So far, that's usually done with fossil fuels, gas in particular. So wind power in Denmark, for example, is balanced by power from Sweden and power from Germany, and their non-fossil fuel power to do that. We've never had to actually balance a renewable power network. where it's a standalone system. We've never had to do it. It's always been balanced off at something else. But in the actual splits required for the future, wind and solar represent 70% of the sector now, and they're so large that they can't be balanced off something else. Right, so let's look at that. This is solar radiance for Berlin in 2015. Now, power has to be delivered in a steady, stable, sinusoidal, clean fashion. Stable no matter what. So let's pretend this graph now represents 38% of the global energy mix. Solar radiance is not power generation, but it is a proxy for the ability to do power generation. I've got a case study in a minute. So let's take this line. This line is the stable amount of power that we can produce. Anything over that line, we need to catch and store. Anything under that line needs to be released. So what this line is showing, that the sun in summer is stronger than the sun in winter. Yeah, right. So this is the problem with solar power. Solar power is to be stable all the time. It's got to generate all the time. It needs to actually get this. The power buffer would need to collect excess power over 6 months, store it for something like 6 to 7 months, and then release it over 6 months after that when we're actually below specification. So that's the buffer there. So that red square is 28 days, 4 weeks or 1 month equivalent. That square there is 48 hours. These are the two references. I ask you, is that enough? And to me, the answer is no. All right, so here's a case study. This is concentrated solar power from a concentrated solar plant in Spain, where the sun shines pretty well compared to the rest of Europe. They had 2 months, one in June, one in November. Now, this is a system that's actually part of a larger network, and it's balanced with the use of gas and coal. But if this was a standalone system, it would be a 670 megawatt system. And the power storage that would be needed to keep things even and stable, you'd need 16.2 days of buffer just for the month of November alone, right? And that's just for 1 month. Remember, there's 6 months where we're actually below par. And that brings us to wind. So that makes the point right there. Solar, to keep it stable, needs a lot of buffer storage. There is a way out of this, and we'll talk about this at the end. Wind is highly variable. A study in the UK done in 2014, they found that power production was so erratic that it couldn't be predicted. It didn't help they got hit with a couple of storms when they did this study. So that is a more civilized wind meterage. That's in November, a couple of months in 2015. So if that graph represented 38% of the global power grid and you had to smooth it out to a straight line, how much buffer do you think you'd need? And would 5 hours be enough? The answer is no. Here is wind produced by Sweden, Denmark, UK, France, and Germany, all overlaid. A couple of things. So you have these peaks, these huge peaks, which they can vary up to 48% in this data set. That's huge. The higher the variation, the bigger the buffer you need to catch that. So then you've also got the problem is when you're seeing a peak or a lull, you're seeing the same thing all over the place. So you can't balance wind power from Sweden to Germany, for example, or France to Denmark, because when one group has trouble, they all have trouble. Just as with solar, when one solar panel system is having low solar radiance all winter, all solar groups in the hemisphere are having the same problem. In practical terms, what was actually brought in 2018, this is the information I collected. Solar produced power 11.4% of the calendar year, and wind was at 24.9%. And I think wind engineering has got it up to 33% now. Even so, most of the time, these assets are standing idle, and there's very little we can do about it. So here's the energy mix I used, and we're going to use a buffer now to look at just wind and solar. In the literature, I found two markers. One was 48 hours. That group looked at only passenger cars and only in Europe. And then there was another study in Drost-Frank 2015 that looked at Europe, and they suggested 1 month of a buffer for the whole system. I'm doing 4 weeks or 28 days for just wind and solar. And that's how I got the 2,192 terawatt hours of capacity that we need to store. The other bookend is 48 hours plus 10%. And these are the two that we use to guide the mineral calculations later. So this is the size of the power buffer. I still think this is actually way too small. Right, so here's the number of vehicles that we items that we need. The technological units to phase out fossil fuels looks something like this. So here is our electric vehicle system and their batteries. So the electric vehicle systems are 1.39 billion in number. There's the hydrogen fuel cells, which number only 29 million. Now, the hydrogen fuel cell systems are doing all the work, all the heavy carrying. So while the hydrogen economy is much, much, much smaller than the electric vehicle fleet, it must take precedence due to the work that it's actually doing. So there's the wind turbines, 70% onshore, 30% offshore, as per what the IEA recommends. Solar panels, and there's our stationary power down the bottom. Now, each one of these things, all of them are to replace a fossil fuel tech system in some form. Now, they harvest sunshine and wind. Let's say like wind is renewable, sunshine is renewable, but the device to harvest them is not renewable. A solar panel wears out after 20 years. A wind turbine wears out of around, is it 20 years? Is it 12 years? It's information is now coming out that it's actually less than we think. Anyway, either way, there comes a point when it needs to be taken down and reconstructed. So these units are replaceables. They're not renewables at all. And each one of these units is manufactured from metals. Right. So hold the phone. If in 2020, less than 1% of the transport fleet was electric vehicle, and renewable energy accounted for about 4% of the primary energy pie. The non-fossil fuel system has not been constructed yet. And to construct it, we need some exotic metals like cobalt and lithium that we don't use very much at the moment anyway. So as it has not been constructed, it cannot be recycled. So the first generation at least will have to be sourced from the mining of minerals. And that tells us that minerals are actually the new oil. But which ones? Right, so that came to the second part of the work. So each unit that's actually then predicted, we've got get an estimate of what is the metal content in each unit. These are wind turbines. There's 4 wind turbines models that are thought to dominate the market. How big are they? What's in them? And can we estimate what metals are there? There are estimates on battery chemistries as well. I found a few papers on battery chemistries that actually were more precise. This is kilograms per vehicle, but what vehicle? A bus has a much bigger battery than a passenger car. But this is to show that there's such information exists in the rough proportions. And this is like a skip across the top. This work is going into a peer-reviewed journal, all calculations, and in about 80 tables of data. So we're just seeing like a skip across the top. We get to this point here. So we've got an estimate. This is light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles. We've got an estimate in the year 2040, what would the market share be of the different chemistries? And so that allows us to get these sort of proportions in the market. And we could do the same thing for power storage. And that leads to, well, we know what's actually in each chemistry, and we know how many of these batteries we need and what quantities. So now we can actually estimate for each chemistry type, which by metal, copper, lithium, magnesium, etc., manganese, all of that gets compressed into one column at the end. And that's all, and then we can get to this point here. Red column is the total metal required, solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, their batteries, etc., 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 but assuming a 28-day buffer. The blue is assuming a 48-hour buffer. The yellow is our reported reserves, and the black is the global production as of 2029. This is a log scale. You're looking at, now remember, this is just for the first generation of stuff. 20 years later, you do it all again. in some form, and that puts pressure on recycling, which has its own problems. Okay, here's rare earths. So I couldn't find any information on the reserves of rare earths, but I was able to find some production values. Our ability to deliver rare earths in the needed volumes is woeful. Like germanium is probably the worst. We are well below what is needed. Now, what I often hear is reserves are different to resources. Price goes up, more resources become reserves, and life's good. Stop your whining. All right, let's look at that. So the red is the 28-day buffer. The yellow, so that's the column on the left. The column on the right is made up of reserves, the yellow, resources on land, which is the green, resources under the sea that we know of. That's the purple. So at this time, all the metal on planet Earth that we know of is in the right, and on the left is the metal that we need to replace the first generation of stuff around you now, and you do it all again in 20 years. This is not going to work, guys. We need a better plan. So I'm not for a moment saying that the green transition won't or should not happen. It will. We just need to do it better in a different way. Here is another marker for that. From 2020 back to 4000 BC, human species mined 700 million tons of copper. To keep up with economic growth, just as it is normally, we will do the same in the next 22 years. All right, so current reserves are 880 million tons. That's about 30 years. Now, there is a pipeline. We are discovering more deposits. We are bringing them online. Is the pipeline big enough to support that? The answer is probably not, because the copper industry at the moment is struggling. So we're not running out of copper. The entire Andes mountain range is one big giant copper deposit that's really, really, really low grade. What we are running out of is our ability to access those deposits. Our mining technology can only go so far. On top of this, we now want 4.7 billion tons of copper to manufacture the first generation of stuff. And that on its own is 6.75 times the historical mining quantity. It's probably not going to happen. So mining production, reserves and resources are simply not enough to manufacture the first generation of renewable technology. What does it mean? Let's state the bleeding obvious. Current plans for the after oil are simply not good enough, coupled with oil is going now. Whether it's for climate change reasons or for whether it's market unreliable depletion reasons, whatever, it's going. And our thinking simply is not good enough. We seriously underestimated the scale of the task ahead. Battery chemistries other than lithium-ion will be developed in parallel. You can make batteries out of zinc, out of fluoride, out of sodium. Okay, great, but you've got to go and develop the value chain to do that. You can't just magic it up overnight. The energy return on energy invested ratio for renewable energy systems as they are at the moment may not be strong enough to replace fossil fuels. That's actually something we've got to face. Hopes for a future technology breakthrough to somehow deliver more commodity resources don't seem to consider the nature of the resources we have left. And the system has no clue. And has no plans to get one on its dependency on minerals, and does not consider long-term concepts like continuous growth on production against finite resources. What this probably means, doing the green transition as it's planned at the moment will not be possible for 8 billion people. We just don't have the time or the resources. Right, and we're moving into an inelastic market, which that inelastic market will have the more influential nations throwing their weight around to make sure they get what they want at the expense of everyone else. What can change, like we can't change our commodities very easily, and we can't change our technology very easily. What we can change is our ability to respond. Our society can contract and change we can change what we do. A significant reduction in resource consumption. It'll be difficult, but it's something we can actually control. it does imply a radically different system of governance of what's in place today. Now, I'm not describing what that is, I'm implying that it will be necessary one way or another. So it leads to the conclusion that the entire green transition in its current form is really a stepping stone to something else, and we really should be giving some thought about what that something else might be, so we can at least have some sort of response instead of like a knee-jerk reaction. Ecological reality and biophysical limitations will reassert itself. The whole system is about to evolve, and we need to make a better plan. This slide is to talk about, this is the final slide, to talk about, well, what could we do? So I've come up with a series of things that we could look at. First of all, conduct a Maslow hierarchy of needs analysis loop, but not just in society as it's done normally, from the point of view of different society functions like industry or food production. What does food production need to function in an order of priorities? What does industry need? And so on. And do it in a series of nested loops and keep going until we get some sort of stabilization. What you end up seeing is we have to reorganize the industrial value chain around a low energy future and a very short supply chain that are spotty in performance. Retool the existing power grid into a network of microgrids. So instead of one big giant grid that runs 100% of the time, at the moment, if there's a trouble anywhere in the grid crashes. And when it does, technology is damaged. What if we would design the grid that it didn't matter if parts of the grid shut down? And if we had each microgrid would then be wrapped around individual systems, like that a microgrid would power a smelter or a mine or a hospital or whatever. Develop an engineering technology that can cope with variable power supply, power spikes, brownouts, blackouts, what have you. If we can do that, if things sort of move up and down. At the moment, wind and solar are very variable, and that's a problem because our electronic equipment cannot tolerate that variation. If we were to develop an electrical engineering technology that could tolerate that, then we wouldn't need the buffer. And if we didn't need the buffer, then a lot of those resource requirements would be taken off the table. So the solution is not flog ourselves trying to find more storage, but to reinvent our technology that actually uses the power. Plan for reprioritization of industrial capacity. In this world, different industries will be more important than others. Plan for a systemic merging of energy and raw material feedstock supply with all industrial actions. These are no longer just costs of doing business, they are now rate-determining steps. Plan for an economy where instead of actually performance 100% of the time, periodically it can shut down. And as it shuts down and starts up, it can do so without damaging its business model or the systems around it. In the north, I suppose in the south it's the same. If you plan for a period of dormancy over winter, for example, that would make life a lot easier. Develop an engineering decision-making system that can define whether an industrial outcome is logistically sensible or economically viable to a new set of constraints. At the moment, we use money to do this. What if we were to use an energy term like exergy or empathy or something? And if we had an ecological term in there, could we do that? Develop capability to quickly find substitutions for material products or industrial outcomes as the supplies become non-linear, unreliable, and unavailable. Plan for the chaos and don't be surprised when it happens. Evaluate what's really needed, then plan to do it on a regional scope instead of a global one. Right, thanks. That is the presentation. What have we got for questions? Is anyone still there?
Yeah, we're still here. Thank you, Simon. That was very informative and detailed. So this is now your opportunity in the audience to ask questions. So you put those in the Q&A. We won't be able to get to all the questions today in the time available, but I will do my best to pull out questions that broadly reflect where people's interests are. We'll start with a question from Dipendra, who asks, how are power stations defined in terms of renewable energy? So what when you talk about a solar or a wind power station, what do you mean by its nature and scope?
So renewable power is broken up into about 5 or 6 subcategories. You got wind, you got solar, you got geothermal, you got biomass to waste. There's a whole lot of that. So that doesn't include nuclear, but nuclear is classed as non-fossil fuel. So within that, then you've got the different classifications of wind, for example. Is it onshore turbines or is it offshore turbines? So you've got your different specifications there. Then, according to the Global Energy Observatory, they had all registered solar and wind and all the registered stations of all the different kinds that I could get data on, including wave and tidal. How big were they? How many turbines, for example, did they have in them, and how much power did they deliver on an annual basis? And I got about 10,000 examples of power stations. And so I was able to run some statistics on what the average station delivered. And the average station is, if, for example, is say 33 megawatts of installed power, which would involve a number of wind turbines or a number of solar panels. And so that was how I actually sort of pinned it to that.
Okay, great. So a question from Michael Worth Grant Thornton, a reference to Mark Jacobson's book, No Miracles Needed, has a view of mining that mining will not limit the wholesale transition to wind, water and solar, and could actually reduce extraction. And he's wondering what your views, Simon, are on that perspective.
So I looked at Mark Jacobson's work. There was actually 4 of them that came out, and the premise behind his study is an economic market study, and where it's a cost-based thing. He hasn't really sort of looked at what material needs there actually are. All the studies that I've seen at the future would make these sort of generic and vague assumptions of how much material we would actually need. I didn't see any, for example, estimates of the number of cars they would need to service, or the number of wind turbines they need to manufacture. That level of engineering requirements and logistical requirements doesn't seem to be part of any of these studies. And while my calculation is quite crude, and a more sophisticated one is entirely possible, the simple math is showing, and it's grade 9 level math, is showing that we will need quantities of metal. So the outcome that Jacobson has come to, and there's several others who've come to the same conclusion based, and they tend to reference each other. They're not basing these things on engineering reality or any mineral resources. And so I would respectfully disagree with his conclusions. I'm happy to debate that with him if it turns up that way. So where the grey area is how big should the buffer be for wind and solar? That is the bone of contention. And to get that number correct is what changes things.
Yep. Great. Okay, now a question from a different direction. This is from Cheryl Durant. Have you factored in the energy requirements for military systems?
So I just looked at, in a very sort of broad brush terms, of what was reported in 2018 in terms of consumption, and that was all. It was just the civilian market. The problem with trying to preempt what military is trying to do is they don't tell you what they're really doing, and so I just went for a very, very simplistic level. But once you actually understand the basic thesis that comes out of my work, and everyone decides to do something else, then the work is actually obsolete. Now, the reason I actually did it is I was sitting in the audience at the European Commission, listening to these guys handing down the tablets of what they think the future was going to be. And my work was defined around all policies that they thought they were going to do in the future. And that is where the trouble starts. And so there are lots of things we could do, is my point. There are lots of innovations that we could do, but most of them are not listened to. They're not taken seriously. So my work was to show that we should be taking these other ideas seriously. And yes, someone else can come in and make a more sophisticated study that involves other things.
Okay. Another question from Heather Lovell. She's interested in other forms of storage that don't use minerals, such as pumped hydro, or making hydrogen from electrolysis and using this as storage. Did you consider these in your analysis?
I went down the rabbit hole in terms of what storage we can use. Pumped hydro is the cheapest way to do it. It's the most sensible way to do it. The problem is it requires a geographical circumstance that allows you to do it. You need a site that you are capable of putting a hydro plant on, and now you need a reservoir at an elevated level to actually collect water in and then use it later. Are possibilities to expand the hydro system? Can we actually expand it enough to store 2,000 terawatts a year? And that simple answer came back as a no. And when I actually asked a couple of government officials in, I think this was in France, and they said, look, the problem with pumped hydro is you've got to find sites to actually do it, and that's more problematic than actually sort of zoning a power station. They all wanted batteries. Now, the reason they wanted a battery was it can be deployed in any weather, in any place, in any size, in any footprint, and it can be moved. Right, whereas all other systems have scale-up problems like spinning flywheels, compressed air. They work, they have their place, but they have scale-up issues. And hydrogen is an interesting one. So if it takes about 55 kilowatt hours to produce hydrogen, and then when you put that hydrogen back into a PEM cell, you get 15 kilowatts back. So it's actually 27% efficient just at that level. The problem with hydrogen is we don't really have the technology to store and transport hydrogen because it turns everything brittle. To any given pipe or storage tank tends to become materially quite brittle. And so the logistics of actually sort of moving hydrogen around, we've yet to actually get our arms around that. The idea of storing large amounts of hydrogen at the moment has practical feasibility problems. One of the possible evolutions of the hydrogen economy is if we could go straight to ammonia. If you're creating ammonia, you're storing a liquid, it's not as destructive, and you can move it around in ships much more easily. So the hydrogen economy could morph into the ammonia economy, but you still got to produce it first. Where do you get the energy from? As a storage function, I've looked at the numbers associated with hydrogen. I suppose you could do it, but it's not very efficient when you compare to other things. I'd more like to go to spinning flywheels or compressed air than using hydrogen at the moment if I couldn't have pumped hydro. And batteries are what everyone thinks they want, but I've just shown that that's not going to work either. And so the solution to all this is to go back to the drawing board and examine why we need the storage in the first place.
Yeah. So a related question that brings together, kind of covers some of the points made by some people in the Q&A regarding social justice and other dimensions. This is a two-pronged question from Tristan Sykes. Are there any concrete examples, and is it actually possible that a vastly more complex mineral-based energy system can maintain the required degree of complexity across 6 continent supply chains? And given the state of the biosphere, is a mining boom really the most socially and ecologically just way to address limits to growth and civilizational collapse?
So the universal answer to that is no. Right, that's the simple answer to that. The response to that is, every single word in that statement is correct. Right. A mineral-based system will be amazingly complex, and if we lose coal, let's never mind oil. Now, if we lose coal, most of our existing ability to manufacture stuff just checks out. It stops. If we were to go green elements of manufacturing, we could do it, but it'll have to happen on such a small scale compared to what we do now, which means it will not be available for everyone. And so from a biological point of view, the complexity of an organism is defined by the energy you put into it, and the size of the organism is also defined by the energy you put into it. Reduce that energy, it must shrink, and it must become simpler. That is actually what's going to happen to us. And so that question diagnoses most of the real problems of why we are now going to shrink. And the answer is, we as a society have got to reinvent ourselves so we can become simpler and smaller and more decentralized.
Yeah, the complexity of our predicament at the moment is quite mind-boggling if you start bringing in geology, energy, politics, society.
You end up inventing more swear words, more innovative swear words.
That's correct. Okay, so time for two more questions. Quite a few people have asked about nuclear. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that.
So this might scare the hell out of a few people. My first foray into nuclear was to find that the existing nuclear system, as it stands at the moment, cannot expand fast enough to be useful. Right. So if we were to bring online an extra 25 reactors a year, starting from 2025, and if each reactor only took 5 years to build, not 30, would that make a difference? And the answer was, well, nuclear is about 10%. It's about 10, it's a little under it, 10% of our energy pie at the moment. If we were to go to 100% and then we were to phase out fossil fuels as well, at that fantastic rate of expansion, we'd only get 60% of the way there in 75 years, at which point all existing resources of uranium will be exhausted. Now, you can go find more, that's not a problem. The point is, we cannot expand fast enough to deliver the power to support what we need because it's so slow. So nuclear in its current form, and the other problem is, what do we do with this massive stockpile of spent nuclear fuel when things are good and everything's working, we are still cutting corners in terms of promises of how to manage that spent nuclear stockpile. That's your politics for you. So the first part of the answer is the existing nuclear power systems cannot help us, but they are absolutely, the ones we have are absolutely necessary to maintain what we've got. The second answer, and this is a relatively new evolution, along the way, I looked at a whole series of unconventional ideas. And what I'm finding is every single sector of the energy sectors, every single solution we've got at the moment in conventional fashion has a logistical scale-up problem. Whether it's oil, gas, and coal, or it's wind, or solar, or hydro, they all work in their own fashion, but they have a scale-up threshold problem. What is required is one of those sectors has to evolve into something unprecedented in an innovative way. And I've been looking for that innovation. And there are several things, deep geothermal drilling, if that comes up, that could be one of them, for example. But what I'm now looking at is liquid thorium fuel in a molten salt reactor, coupled with the idea of modular small-scale units. Now, let me unpack that for a moment. Thorium fuel is like a uranium fuel, but it doesn't have the nasty radioactive signatures. It's much easier to handle. The solid fuel thorium reactor is not practical, and that's where most of the existing discussion goes to, the thorium. The problem is, halfway through using the fuel, you've got to take the fuel out of the reactor while it's very radioactive and clean it, because it's contaminated, and then put it back in the reactor. And that is problematic. And everyone goes, too hard, waste of time, let's go back to uranium. But if you had a liquid salt system, then that problem doesn't exist. You don't need to take you put the fuel in and it stays in there till it's burned up. Right? This actually worked at the Oak Ridge Laboratory in the 70s, and they actually had an 8 megawatt power system that went for 6,000 hours without a problem. The American president shut the whole system down. What I believe is happening is we made a conscious choice back in the 70s not to look at thorium in this context, in exchange for camouflaging the nuclear weapons program. There's a civilian nuclear power plant system will camouflage the manufacture of nuclear weapons. Take away uranium civilian power, then that weapon system is now exposed. So the decision was made not to do it. China, what I do know is China actually has a liquid thorium molten salt reactor at a modular scale. It's a 2 megawatt system. I've got a photograph of it. And they claim it's been working since 2022. Is that true? Well, Chinese, what do you want? And so, but looking at the actual documentation and the reports from, that were declassified, I can't see a reason why we shouldn't look at this. Now, let's say that's true, as in it works out. Someone's they're going to develop it, they've got to build it, and then they've got to get it out to everyone else. That's going to take time. And we have so many problems of macro scale on the books at the moment, that may not be practical. As in, it's not going to be for all of us. So now we're back to, we've got a problem. But I'm now starting to see solutions. But if we started looking at those solutions 20 years ago, we'd be having a different conversation now. But we didn't. Right? So the short answer is, there are ideas that are worth looking at.
Okay, great. So final question now, and this kind of brings it back to, I think, to how we live our everyday lives and what we can do in terms of our homes and individual lives. A lot of big corporations, or some big corporations, are making claims about recycling and how they are moving, progressing by 2025 or 2030 to use recycled cobalt, for example, in all their products. You mentioned in your presentation that there were limits or constraints on recycling. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Right. So the real problem with recycling is not the recycling technology itself. Right? Two things. We're not designing stuff to be recycled. Most stuff's actually designed not here, usually China. They don't care. It's all about money for them. They really don't care. So the stuff that's coming into our system, like your iPhone, I think it was 2015, where someone actually realized that the iPhone at the time had no recycling solution. It was so integrated, so micronized that they couldn't even get the battery out. And so their solution was just to put the whole thing in the furnace and kiss all those rare elements goodbye. So point one, design for recycling. But the design has to be captured in a way where we can plan our recycling that it's actually possible. Then there's the society's function. The biggest challenge to keep recycling going is to get the right residue to the right process plant. So we need to get enough of the like with like into the recycling plants, but in large enough quantities and in a consistent form that they can actually run a process plant. At the moment, that has proven to be almost impossible because we throw all our rubbish together in one pile and it's really difficult to sort. And so a lot of these problems are actually not technical at all. Then when you get to the technical side of things, you've got to make the choice of how much energy do you put into something to get out? Like, at what point is it not worthwhile? And the final problem with recycling, let's say you've got a cup of coffee. I've got a cup of coffee here, right? In this cup of coffee, we put some water, we put some milk, and we've put like a spoon of coffee. Mix it up. Nice. How do I then recycle that to get the water back, the milk back, and the coffee back in a usable form? And so these things have been chemically transformed, and that is the case for so many of our products at the moment. And that comes down to, what is it we are using and what for? And so if we go back to the drawing board and ask that question at the very start of the process. So design, recycling, manufacture, but also exploration of minerals and mining, they all got to sit around the same table at once and have a frank and adult discussion about all things everywhere all at once.
Yeah, very complex.
All very simple.
Look, thank you so much, Simon, for that in-depth and thought-provoking and sobering analysis of our predicament. at the moment. Someone in the Q&A did ask if you could share your swear words with us all.
Son of a hairy goat herder is a crowd pleaser. Yeah, some of the other ones possibly might get me banned off YouTube.
Yeah, stupid koalas. There's one for you.
Well, I've actually found the Klingon language is lots of fun to play silly buggers with in front of a crowd, say at the United Nations. You will die with honor.
Okay. Fantastic.
Swear words are fun, and so is trolling.
Yeah. So on that note, I will say thanks again to Simon, and thanks to our international cross-sector audience. We had hundreds of people register for this event, which was fantastic, having that kind of reach. And thank you to all the audience members that submitted questions. We couldn't get to them all, but hopefully you'll find Simon online somewhere and ask him in a different forum. So thank you, Simon. And good evening or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are.
Indeed.